Welcome everyone. This is wonderful. I know it's hard coming out on a Sunday night after dark in the cold, so we appreciate this very much. This is our last lecture of 2024, so that's wonderful. We've had a great year. We've learned lots of wonderful, interesting, different things, everything from about Joshua Chamberlain to the Lincoln County News, a wide variety of historical topics. So that's been a lot of fun. We're already thinking about programs for next year. So if you have ideas about speakers or topics, please let us know. We're going to actually, our program committee is going to meet this week and we're going to start talking about that. So a couple things. Number one, please remember to silence your cell phones. Yep, I did that. And in case you haven't been to the restroom and noticed the sign and the issue there, some reason there's a plumbing issue. Sorry about that. So there are some buckets of water that can be used, so you can avail yourselves of that. But if you can make it till you get home, that's probably better. So I'm Jody Batchelder. I'm the vice chair of the board of Old Bristol Historical Society. And we're presenting this lecture, like we did the previous one, in collaboration with South Bristol Historical Society, which is an awesome collaboration, which we hope to continue to do more of. So Nancy Adams is here. She's the vice president of that society. So yeah, she's waving to you in the back.
Oh,
so
yeah, I've met Nancy before. Yeah.
Thanks for collaborating with us. We love that. It's a great way to, reach more people, but also learn from each other too. So it's great. So we're here to welcome Carol Gardner. And I'm going to just tell you a few things about her so she can get embarrassed. She grew up in the Portland area, went to Deering High School, and went to college at Barnard, and then on to Johns Hopkins for her PhD in English. So she's been writing for a very long time, about over 30 years. And but she's also been a teacher. She was on the faculty of Johns Hopkins as well as Wake Forest and Florida State University. So that's pretty impressive. And she's also, and I had to look this up, what this is. She's a past winner of the Maryland Individual Artist Award, which recognizes the importance of artists and their work to Maryland's cultural vibrancy. I assume that was for writing?
Yes.
Yeah,
it was.
Yeah, wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What I found intriguing when I went, this is what you sort of get from her website, but, that's being very modest. I had to go dig a little bit further to find a little bit more about Carol. And I was intrigued because she's done a lot of different kinds of things. She's published both fiction and nonfiction in a wide variety of publications, including the World of Baseball series, BluePlanet Quarterly, Northwest Review, Baltimore Review, Potomac Review, the Women's Review of Books, Portland Press Herald, and the Washington Post, so very prestigious. And she's worked as a journalist, and I love this, she was a restaurant reviewer for the Coastal Journal. That sounds like a fun job. She worked as a consultant for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She's also worked as a consultant to Finca International, and they are a nonprofit microfinance organization. And she worked as the director of publications for the Ocean Conservancy. So she's got some breadth here. But she's here tonight to talk about history and the history of this particular book, which is The Involuntary American, A Scottish Prisoner's Journey to the New World, which talks about the life and times of Thomas Doughty, who was an illiterate Scottish foot soldier who was captured and shipped to New England against his will. And I didn't realize when I read her book that she has a special connection to Thomas Doughty, which I hope she'll share with us. She is going to have her book for sale after the lecture, and she will take your questions too. Yay. And there's one last thing. She's got a new book coming out in the spring, and that is called The Divided North, Black and White Families in the Age of Slavery. So maybe she'll come back and talk to us about that. So please welcome Carol Gardner.
Thank you.
Can it go on
Better?
this thing? Or does she have to
I
hold
have to
it?
hold it, I have to practically eat it, right? Okay. I can,
Sorry about that. Can you work
I
with
can
that?
deal with this, yeah, I'm sure I can. Anyway, thanks again, everybody, for coming out. I appreciate it. So tonight, we're going to talk about a period of history even more turbulent than the one we live in now, which it always makes me feel so much better to say that. We're going to talk about a group of Scots who came to New England by force. And these are the Scottish prisoners of 1650 and 1651. So there were 422 of these fellows, and I don't know all their stories, but my book, The Involuntary American, discusses what life was like for a few of them. And as I was researching their lives, I gained a new perspective on early Maine and early New England society. So that's what I want to share with you tonight. I think we're all familiar, if you grew up in New England in particular, you're probably familiar with our sort of founding narrative, and that is that the Pilgrims were chased out of England because of the way they worshiped, and they arrived here in the New World, and they found religious freedom. Well, the story I'm going to tell tonight is a bit different from that one. In fact, it's sort of the inverse of that one. So anyway, is anybody in this room tonight, does anybody know whether they're descendants of these Scottish prisoners or not?
We have one.
See, there's 4 of us, which is really fascinating to me. And I think that I've given this talk dozens of times. I've given it another dozen times on Zoom. And every time I do, there's a handful of descendants in the audience, which shows you how important these guys actually were. And when I've been giving it on Zoom, some of the people come from as far away as Scotland, California, Canada, Texas, the Carolinas. So their DNA just came here and now they're spread all over the place. It's kind of amazing. Anyway, let's start with the big picture. I want you to look at this image, and this is how I'd like you to imagine the ports of the in the 17th century. Hang on a second here. Of the Atlantic Basin in the 1600s and 1700s, with ships and people and goods being constantly transported back and forth between Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. So this was really the zenith of what we call the first global age. And we talk about living in a global age right now, okay? But this is the beginning of it. And even though it's very, very long time ago, it's important to note that people were traveling, they were moving, they were exploring, and they were trading across the oceans. So it was very, very busy. Of course, communication was much slower, but people were still moving about and communicating. So here we have our Scottish prisoners. As you can see, 150 from the Battle of Dunbar arrived in Boston in 1650. It was winter. It was late December when they arrived. Dunbar. You say Dunbar instead of Dunbar.
Where was that?
Oh, where was Dunbar? Dunbar is in Scotland. It's in the southern part of Scotland, sort of below Edinburgh, between the border and Edinburgh, let's say. In 1651, 272 additional prisoners arrived in Boston from the Battle of Worcester. And most of these men were sold for 20 to 30 pounds each. And 62 of them became property of an iron foundry.
Who was sending them here?
Well, this is what we're going to talk about now. So these battles, the battles of Dunbar and Worcester, were decisive battles in the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms were England, Scotland, and Ireland. And the conflicts are sometimes referred to as the English Civil Wars. But the Three Kingdoms were under one ruler, Charles I, okay? But Ireland was mostly Catholic, Scotland was Presbyterian, and England, the Anglicans and the Puritans were fighting against each other to see who would have power. Charles was unpopular across the board, okay? Nobody liked him. The Anglicans were okay with him because he was an Anglican and they knew that he'd enforce their ways, but everybody else really couldn't stand him. And in fact, they fought against him. At times, the Scots and the Puritans fought together against him. So Charles is like, I don't get any respect. What am I going to do? So he said, I have an idea. I'll make everybody worship the way I worship. Then I'll be the head of both the state and the church, and I'll get more respect and everyone will listen to me. Well, this made everyone angry except the Anglicans, okay? So in 1649, Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan military leader and a powerful member of Parliament, had King Charles I beheaded. And Cromwell seized control of government. This is a period in England we call the interregnum, the period between kings, right? So the problem is the Scots were livid at this point. Even though they fought with Cromwell against Charles, they had not given him permission to cut off the king's head and seize control of their country as well as England, as well as Ireland. So they mustered large armies to fight Cromwell and to try and reinstall the king's son, Charles II, and Presbyterianism as the predominant religion in Scotland and England. Well, to make a long story short, Cromwell won both of these battles, both Dunbar and Worcester. And he captured as many as 10,000 young men at each battle. So he has 20,000 young Scotsmen on his hands. What is he going to do with these guys? And he's afraid. I mean, he released some of the ones who were terribly wounded, and he let them go home. But he's afraid if he releases the rest of them, that they're going to go home, grab their weapons, and come back and cause more trouble for him. So he has them shipped away, right? And he shipped them to places including England, France, Barbados, and right here in New England. And those sent to the Americas were either sold or conveyed as property. Okay, so this is really a case of individuals being sent to New England against their wills because of religion. Okay, I'm going to pause for drinks here between slides so that my voice lasts all night. You might think that shipping 2 boatloads of prisoners to New England to be sold at Boston was a rare occurrence, but it wasn't. The fact is, many, many individuals came to New England against their wills in the 17th century. And I want to look at that for a minute to see the big picture of involuntary migration, because it was kind of important. It was something I never learned about in school. So early in the century, the Council for New England was a kind of an advisory council to the king. And they urged him to order magistrates across the country to send, quote, the poorer sort of people to New England. Okay, so does this mean that they entice them with free meals and free transportation and free nights in local hotels? No, it doesn't. It means that they gathered these people up from the streets against their wills, threw them in the holds of ships, and transported them here as laborers, right? And look at the rationale for doing so. It's kind of interesting. It will thereby disburden the Commonwealth of a multitude of poor that are likely daily to increase to the infinite trouble and prejudice of the public state. So it's kind of, not only does it lack any compassion, it basically blames the poor for damaging the country, dragging it down, okay? Rather than trying to do anything about them, it just says, well, let's get rid of them, okay? Scottish government was doing the same type of thing. You can see magistrates in Edinburgh wanted to send both men and women convicts abroad. Okay, so colonial America at this point, including New England, is looking a bit less like a land of religious freedom and more like a repository for cast-offs of English and Scottish society. Now, sadly, children are part of this trend. In his journal, John Winthrop, who's the founder and governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, writes about 20 unaccompanied children arriving in Massachusetts, as he says, with many more to come after. As you can imagine, these children were mostly orphans and indigent children, and they too became laborers in New England. There was such a need for servants that the trade in servants became a profitable enterprise. And kidnapping rings developed in British Isles during the 17th century. So if you're a parent, say in Bristol or London or Aberdeen, you better hang on to your children, right? And by all means, keep them away from the docks. What's really sad, I think, is that Winthrop actually documents the death of one of these children, a young boy named Nathaniel Sewell, and the trial of his master, who was found guilty of causing that boy's death through harsh treatment. So it was tough if you had to come here as a servant. Now, Africans, too, were part of this trend. This is the receipt for the sale of a young black girl named Luce or Lucy to a man in Boston named Robert Sharp. Now, even though this receipt is from 95 years after our Scottish prisoners arrived, there were plenty of enslaved Africans in New England in the 17th century. One of the first New Englanders to enslave Africans was a man named Samuel Maverick, who lived on Noddle's Island as early as 1638. Now, Noddle's Island is in Boston Harbor. Does anybody know it? Yeah, it's right where Logan Airport is. Yeah, so that's where some of the first African slaves in New England were held, right there. And Maverick wasn't the only person to hold African slaves. Massachusetts Bay Governor Simon Bradstreet, husband of poet Anne Bradstreet, enslaved Africans. Cotton Mather, who's I mentioned here, who's a clergyman and historian from a very politically powerful family, received an enslaved African as a gift from his congregation. So that shows you where slavery stood in the eyes of even the most pious Puritans in New England. Okay, and Maine had its own share. Maine had enslaved Africans as well. The Shapley and Pepperell families of Kittery, you might have heard of both of them. Robert Cutts of Kittery and Captain Brian Pendleton of Saco, they all enslaved people of African heritage in the mid-1600s. Now, it's important to note at this point that Africans had a very different experience from other kidnapped individuals. So just because you're kidnapped and taken away to work doesn't mean that you're a slave, okay? Most of the Africans became slaves for life, okay? And if they had children, upon being born, those children became property of the master. Okay, this was not the case for any European individuals that I'm aware of. Okay, white individuals, like our Scottish prisoners, had finite terms of servitude. They were prohibited from marrying while they were servants, but if they did have children, those children were born free. Okay, so so I refer to our Scottish prisoners as forced laborers, and there were quite a few at the time in New England. Now, this is just to show you that there's our 422 at the top that we're talking about tonight, but there were 1,300 more from Scotland who were transported to Barbados, and later in the century, another 227 participants in Argyll's Rising were sent to Jamaica and New Jersey. Those are just Scots, and those are just the ones that I found, in a short amount of research. So it's the veritable tip of the iceberg. There were tons of people coming here under duress, either from Scotland or from England or from France or from wherever. There were lots from Ireland as well. What you may not have known is that as many as 1,000 Native American combatants were shipped away from New England as servants after King Philip's Wars and the Pequot Wars, and they were shipped to places like the Caribbean and Madeira. So what's going on here? Well, governments are really engaged in a form of social engineering. They're kind of moving populations around to try and solve social problems, okay? And the Scottish prisoners were a larger part of that trend because, of course, they felt that they could cause problems. So now let's go into a little more detail about what life was like for the prisoners once they arrived here. You'll see I use a lot of winter scenes because, of course, that's when they arrived. Imagine, coming from being shipped over 3,000 miles away and arriving here in the middle of winter. And winters were worse in the 17th century. So, it would have been pretty tough. As I said, we know that some 62 Scots from the Battle of Dunbar became property of iron foundries at Saugus and Braintree, Massachusetts. And this company was called Hammersmith Iron Works. And it was one of the earliest industrial sites, or efforts, it was 2 sites actually, in North America. And as you can imagine, iron was really important at the time. They used it for everything, for pots and tools and weapons and nails and all kinds of things. And before Hammersmith was established in the 1640s, all those items had to be imported from Europe, which made them very, very expensive. The New England industrialists who purchased these men, they may have been pious Puritans, but they were also enthusiastic capitalists. Okay, so they were here. The notion that people were here just for religion, I think, has been overblown. That these guys were here to make money. Okay, and they had some free laborers, and they were anxious to use them. And they were very anxious because the ongoing wars in Britain that we talked about the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, and that was just part of it. Everybody was being conscripted into the army. So they weren't able to get a large number of servants here, and they really needed them to do the work. Now, I don't know, maybe some of you have been here. This is the Saugus Ironworks National Historic Site in Saugus, Massachusetts. And it's a reconstructed replica of the original campus on the Saugus River. And this is where the 62 went. And in winter, which is when they arrived, they would have been put to work right away, cutting and felling large numbers of trees, curing the wood and making charcoal for the ironworks furnaces. In summer, they mined the ore by digging into sodden, marshy earth. You can see in the foreground that it's marshy. That's the river, and it's marshy all around. And that's the type of soil you wanted for the iron ore. And they'd be in there up to their hips, digging this out in the heat with the mosquitoes, etc. So this is not fun work, but anyway, they received rudimentary clothing and housing. We know that they lived together, two to a bed, in large bunkhouses that they probably built themselves. Now, some of the records of this company still exist. That's why I'm able to tell you this stuff. And they can be found in Harvard's Baker Library. And I've given you an indication here from those papers of the kinds of things that they ordered for them to eat. And those were all considered to be staples, including the case of strong waters. Okay, so at the time, people didn't want to just drink water. They didn't trust it. Europeans certainly didn't trust it. So the strong waters were very important. Now, the truth is that these soldiers probably ate better here than they had in a long time. As prisoners of war, they'd been marched from Dunbar in Scotland, where they were captured, to Durham in England, where they were imprisoned in Durham Cathedral. That's a distance of 100 miles. Now, during that trek, they were given no food nor any water. Okay, so they were drinking from mud puddles and eating weeds along the way. Moreover, they had also fasted for 2 days before the battle began. Okay, so just imagine this. That's how they prepared themselves for battle. So along the route to Durham, they were literally dropping like flies. This was a veritable death march. They were dropping like flies from dysentery, dehydration, malnutrition. And when they got to the cathedral, they continued to die at a rate of 30 per day and were buried in large burial pits. It's also important to note that these Scottish soldiers were raised during very lean times in Scotland, during some of the worst famines and droughts in the country's history, during what's called the Little Ice Age. You may have heard of it. It's a period of severe weather extremes, a lot like we're experiencing now, only colder. And in 2013, when archaeologists from Durham University excavated one of these mass graves just outside of Durham Cathedral, they analyzed the bones of the soldiers and found high incidence of nutritional diseases such as rickets and scurvy, not just when they were captured and afterwards, but throughout their lifetimes. So it was very tough growing up in Scotland in those days. So when they got here, at least the prisoners had food to eat, okay? And there's no indication that they were used particularly cruelly at Saugus and Braintree. But they had been forced into exile 3,000 miles away from their families, and they'd had no say in their servitude. And we have to remember they were considered property of the company. So Scots were also sold to lumber mills at Piscataqua. And you folks probably know Piscataqua is the river that separates Maine from New Hampshire. But back in the day, I want you to see it not so much as a border, but I want you to see all these rivers as a network of, a transportation network, essentially, because that's how they were used. And Piscataqua comprised areas on both sides of the river. So it was just a region, At Squamscott, which is present-day Exeter, New Hampshire, 7 to 8 Scottish prisoners were purchased by a man named Nicholas Lisson for his sawmill. Now, Lisson himself was a Scottish Presbyterian, and he actually emigrated here voluntarily. So he bought these men, and what's really interesting is that all 3 of his daughters ended up marrying Scottish servants that he purchased from the battles of Dunbar and Worcester. So this is a very good deal for Lisson. He gets workers for his mill and husbands for his daughters, right? But it's hard to find a better investment than that. Among these men was a man named John Bean, or John MacBean, and he was a prisoner from the Battle of Worcester. And Bean married Hannah Lisson. And I mention the 2 of them because they're the original American ancestors of L.L. Bean. So you can see these, as I say, these guys are everywhere. At Oyster River in present-day Durham, New Hampshire, as many as 18 Scottish prisoners ended up at Valentine Hill's mill. Now, Hill was not a Scot. He was a well-connected Puritan merchant. And Thomas Doughty, who's the main character in my book, was purchased by Valentine Hill. Another 15 to 25 Scottish prisoners worked at the Great Works sawmill at Newickawanack, they pronounce it, South Berwick, Maine, which was a 20-saw operation. Note that it's also called Unity Parish, and the reason it's called that is because the name of the ship that those prisoners came over on was the Unity. Okay. So there were other sites in New England too where these Scots went. Some of them went to individual farms and workshops, but I'm trying to give you sort of the largest groupings of them. So here. Now the Scots at Piscataqua were also engaged in very physical labor. That's why these guys were here. And in winter, they cut down trees by hand using saws and axes to haul them from the woods with the teams of oxen. In spring and summer, they transport those logs downstream to sawmills for processing and shipment. This is dangerous and grueling work. I don't know if any of you have worked in logging, but even now that it's mechanized, it's very dangerous. Imagine doing all this by hand. We know at least of 2 Scottish prisoners who died from having tree limbs and branches and trunks falling on them. And we know of another 2 who drowned while floating those logs downstream. So this is in the records of, the early records of Maine. Of course, lumber mills were essential to the settlement of New England and other American colonies. I'm sure you know that a lot of the wood was shipped abroad to England, but a lot of it was also shipped to the Caribbean because they ran through their forests very quickly. And a lot of it stayed here because it was used for everything. It was used for building homes, for building mills, meeting houses, fences. It was the fuel for heating and cooking, of course, and it was even used as currency. In the court records, you can often see people paying their debts and fees in pipe staves and board feet rather than English pounds. Now, by the 1670s, the area is booming with sawmills, and that's why I've put this quote up here from William Hubbard. He says that there was at least 1 sawmill on every river and stream along the coast in Piscataqua. Let me go back just for a minute to our map, okay? We know that at the time, there were 15 sawmills between Exeter, New Hampshire, and York, Maine. That's a distance of 25 miles. Okay, there had to have been at least a dozen more between York and Casco Bay, Maine. Okay, so that's a huge number of sawmills. And the virgin forests were disappearing fast. And I just want you, just for a second, to put yourselves in the shoes of the Native Americans and what it must have been like to see these virgin forests of your homeland systematically chewed up in this way, right? It had to be very, very troubling. Now, after 6, 7, or 8 years of labor, as I mentioned before, the Scottish prisoners were set free. So what did they do? Well, the most interesting fact that I can tell you is that we don't know of a single one of the 422 who returned home. And that's kind of interesting. We do know that in January of 1657, 28 Scots, including a number of our former prisoners of war, founded this organization, Scots Charitable Society. And this is just as they're emerging from their terms of servitude. And they didn't have families, and they didn't have other community supports, and they were really, frankly, scared for their welfare in this country. What are they going to do, right? So they got together, and they made regular small payments into a kitty. And they decided as a group who merited assistance. And some of the records of this organization still exist too, and you can look it up and see what they did with them. What did they do? Well, money was often given for burial fees for indigent Scots. Scots too poor to bury themselves. And money was also given to their widows. Because, of course, being a widow on the New England frontier in the 17th century was very, very tough indeed. Now, this organization still exists. Okay? It's the oldest ongoing charitable organization in North America. So these prisoners left behind more than their DNA. They left behind their institutions as well. So we'll talk a little more about what they did once they were freed. And the quote that I've given you is from the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. And you can think of that as a sort of constitution for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it says that servants, upon finishing their terms of servitude, quote, shall not be sent away empty. So as a master, you can't just, look at your guys and say, okay, you're done, goodbye and good luck. You have to offer them something for the years of free work, essentially, that they've given you. So many of our Scottish prisoners received land grants. And this is revolutionary, because had they remained in Scotland, it would have been virtually impossible for any of them to acquire their own land. The land was held by lairds and clan chiefs, and it just was not available for the average individual. But again, we have to think this through. Did the English really have the right to grant lands to former servants? Okay, we got to remember that all of New England, including where we're gathered right now, was and is unceded in indigenous land. Okay, and the English had a motive for granting parcels to British subjects, and you probably intuitively know this, but let's say you're a wealthy merchant and you live in Boston or Salem, and you give a former servant a parcel of land in an outlying area. Well, it's the best opportunity he's going to have in his lifetime. So he's going to defend that land with everything he's got. What does that mean for you? Well, it means you're 10 times more secure, okay? He's your gatekeeper. So any natives who may want to attack you have to go through him first, okay? And the more British subjects who settle these areas, the more, the potentially hostile natives are driven farther away. So that it's very, it's very clear what was going on here. This slide simply shows that a number of servants in Piscataqua received land grants from their masters, and some of them actually from the towns themselves. But Thomas Doughty, the central figure in my book, did not receive land. He received money upon being freed. And did he use that money to pay his fare back to Scotland? No. He used it to purchase land across the river from his former master. So land is another really important reason for people coming to New England and for their staying. And again, at least as important, if not more so, than religious freedom. Early in the 17th century, the English Scots arrive on their ships, and what do they see? They look out from their ships and they see woods, right? That's New England, right? And they said to themselves, oh, look at all this vacant land we can use. Of course, the land wasn't vacant. It was land that the indigenous Americans had used for generations. And so there began to be two competing visions for that land. The European vision involved leveled forests, fenced-in farms, mills, dams, permanent settlements, and individual ownership. This is a lot like how we live today. The Native American vision was very different, of course. It involved intact woods for hunting habitat, open agricultural fields. So they did clear fields for their crops, but they didn't fence them off. Open rivers that allowed migrating fish, upon which they depended very heavily. Seasonal settlements, and a more communal sense of ownership. Now, the Native Americans did feel that they owned the land, but it didn't belong to individuals, okay? It wasn't the property of Squando or Madakawando or Sheepscot John. It belonged to us, okay? So they defended it as a community. And I think these two very distinct visions, you'll see how they come to cause problems. Now, while many of the Scots farmed the land they received, Thomas Doughty, who trained as a lumberman under Valentine Hill, didn't. He cut the timber, he sold it to local sawmills, and then he sold the cleared land as farmland. And because the forests were disappearing in Piscataqua really fast, which we've already talked about, Doughty then had to move north into Maine, looking for other opportunities. So here on the frontier down in York, Maine, Scots form very tight-knit communities. As many as 25 Scots are thought to have settled at Unity Parish, where they received land grants or they purchased parcels. An area in nearby York came to be called Scotland because of the number of former prisoners who settled there, and actually it's still called Scotland. Scots also settled at Kittery, Wells, and Saco, and not alone, but in groups. Many Scots lived together before being married, and some of them lived together after being married, and we'll talk about that in a second. They engaged in joint work contracts, and they stood up for one another in court. So here's an interesting anecdote about how freedom actually put some of these former prisoners in a bind. Peter and James Grant, who were likely kinsmen, if not brothers, were already married when they were taken prisoner in Scotland and shipped by force here. Once they earned their freedom, the local government ordered them to go home because they'd left wives behind in Scotland. You can see, this is from you can see the province and court records of Maine. We present Peter Grant and James Grant for not returning home to his wife. Okay? So this puts them in an interesting catch-22 because they had been sent into exile, and yet once they gained their freedom, local courts, remember these are English courts, ordered them to return home. That would have been difficult if not illegal. I mean, no one knows whether they would have been sort of prosecuted once they got home because they had already been shipped away by the government. So it's quite a bind. I think it's important to remember that married men whose wives lived abroad were seen as threats to the community. And the thought was that they were going to beget children out of wedlock or they were going to commit bigamy by marrying again. That's just what happened. In the Grant's case, rather than return to Scotland, James Grant married a woman in Maine named Joan some 2 to 3 years later. Now to get married in New England, you had to have the blessing of the local magistrates. Okay? So they're married, and the next thing we know, Peter is called into court for cohabiting with Joan, who is pregnant and whose husband James is deceased. Okay? So Peter and Joan are living in one house together, he owning of her as his wife, and they being not married. So this is another huge scandal that this family has caused. What I think happened here, obviously, is that the three of them, Peter and James Grant and Joan, had likely shared a household. And when James died, Peter continued to live there with Joan, who was probably his sister-in-law. And that's what got the two of them into trouble. So Thomas Doughty had to show up in court to support his friend and fellow prisoner. He engaged in a 20-pound bond with him to keep him out of jail and to ensure that he showed up at the next court session. So these guys really supported one another, and to make that bond, they probably put up their land, and 20 pounds was probably almost everything they were worth at the time. But this is typical of the kind of mutual support that we see among the Scottish prisoners. Grant later returned the favor by co-signing a business agreement for Doughty, and we see Doughty put up bonds for several other individuals at various times. So even if the Scots Charitable Society couldn't always reach deep into Maine, the former Scottish prisoners here on the frontier stood by each other through a more informal mutual support society. So what happened to Peter and Joan? Well, they married, and they eventually had some 7 children together. Okay, so this whole episode shows some of the dilemmas that the exiles faced and some of the moral issues they were forced to cope with as a result of having been transported to America. And it shows some of the compromises that the Puritan courts often made for practical purposes. So the very strict moralistic society that was portrayed in Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter wasn't always so strict. I think the magistrates realized, we've got a problem here, we've got to solve it. It's not going to be solved by just hauling these people into court. And they were very careful about not wanting children in the community who didn't have someone to support them. So that was one of their biggest concerns. After 15 to 18 years of building their livelihoods in freedom, these Scots face a new conflict. In 1675, King Philip's War broke out in Massachusetts. There were native communities on both sides of this conflict, but the Wampanoags, led by Metacom or King Philip, led the charge against the English. Now, the issue primarily was land. The Wampanoags were from the South Shore, Cape Cod area. And that's the first area that was settled by the English, right? So land becomes very dear very early on. As English families grew and spread out, the Wampanoags felt that they were just being fenced out of and removed from lands that had been theirs for millennia. And then they would go to English courts. They would take their complaints to English courts, and guess what happened? They lost, right? So they just said there's nothing left for us but violence. So they began to attack English settlements. And like all other able-bodied men, our former Scottish prisoners were required to join local militias and fight alongside the English. And many lived and served on the front lines of this war. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. In Swansea, in Plymouth Colony, where the fighting first broke out, former Dunbar prisoner William Cahoon was one of the war's earliest casualties. John Wattles had been captured at the Battle of Worcester and sent to New England. After servitude, he settled in Chelmsford. Although he died in King Philip's War, we know that he left children behind. And how do we know that? Well, I don't know if you've heard of filmmaker Michael Moore, but he's his direct descendant. Okay, I didn't find that out myself. I actually got that from, cribbed that fact from the PBS show Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates. Maybe watch that, I'm addicted to it. On the eastern frontier, Thomas Doughty and his family were burned out of their home and mill, and they had to move in with 2 other former Scottish prisoners in Wells, Maine, because Wells was more secure than Saco. Well, in 1678, a treaty was signed, and people began to be optimistic that the warring factions could get along. So Thomas Doughty, like many others, returned to his former home in Saco to rebuild. And he began doing quite a booming lumber business at the Saco Falls. It's right where the old textile mills stand today. If you know Saco at all, it's actually on the Biddeford side of the river. And we know he was doing a really good business, and that's because he was being taxed more than almost any other mill owner at the time. If only that were the end of the wars, but it's not. A decade or so after King Philip's War, ethnic violence broke out again. And King William's War pitted the English against the French and Wabanakis, Wabanakis meaning the native communities of New Hampshire and Maine. And you can see from this map, the orange area is where most of the Wabanaki French raids occurred. So the former Scottish prisoners who settled at Piscataqua were right in the hot seat, right? This is at least the fourth war that the former Scottish prisoners had witnessed during their lifetimes. So they had, when they were kids, it had been the Bishop's War. When they were young adults, it had been the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. Then there was King Philip's War. Now there's King William's War. Okay. In 1690, during this war, Fort Loyal, which is Portland, was destroyed. That same year, an observer wrote, quote, "The Indians have overrun 200 miles of coast. They've taken the town and fort at Pemaquid." In 1692, the English built Fort William Henry at Pemaquid to try and maintain control of their eastern territory. Some of you probably know that. And the fort was destroyed again in 1696. So during this war, English settlements north of Wells, Maine were systematically wiped out, and they remained that way for 3 decades. So the French and the Wabanakis did have the upper hand during this war. Once again, the problem was land. The English had signed a treaty at the end of the previous war saying they wouldn't expand their lands. Naturally, they broke that promise. It's one among many, right? In addition, their cattle were getting loose and destroying the natives' corn and cultivated fields. Remember, we talked about how they cultivated fields, but they didn't fence them in. They would have children sort of looking after the crops during the day. But you know, if cattle get into your cornfield, that's the end of it, right? The natives were also upset because the English were not only damming the rivers, but they were placing large nets at the mouths of rivers, including the Saco River. And these were, you know, as I said before, providing critical sources of food with migrating populations of salmon, shad, and herring that the natives depended upon heavily. So the natives said, you know, the English are trying to starve us out. So they were tired of the treatment, and that's why they allied with the French, who were also battling the English over territory. Many of our former Scottish prisoners, as well as others, died in these raids. And many were captured and marched all the way to Quebec. And when I say marched all the way to Quebec, you know, they walked from York County, Maine to Quebec, right? And some were ransomed back, and some died along the way, and some ended up staying there. By 1688, Thomas Doughty had a wife and 7 children, and they abandoned the frontier in Maine for Salem, Massachusetts, leaving home, property, and livelihood behind. They were joined by scores of refugees, and if you know anything about Salem history, you'll know that the refugees streaming in and their constant dire reports of violence on the eastern frontier were key events that helped to precipitate the Salem witch crisis of 1692. So here again at age 58, Thomas Doughty becomes a refugee, and he's forced to start life over. And I wanted to write about him because I found his life so contrary to what I'd been taught. He was an illiterate person born in 1630 in rural Scotland. And you would have thought that he would live out his life within a dozen miles of where he was born. But that's not what happened. He was swept into the vortex of the first global age, was forced by war to immigrate 3,000 miles to America, and once he arrived here, war forced him to abandon his home and livelihood 2 more times. Economic concerns compelled him to move another 5 times. So this is not a safe or secure existence, right? Now, I'm not going to tell you what happened to Thomas Doughty afterwards. For those of you who haven't read my book, it would be a disincentive for you to purchase it. So I'm just going to give you up to here, and that's it. But I've tried to give you a flavor of the culture in which the Scottish prisoners lived and the obstacles they were up against. If you just got enough patience to last another 2 minutes, I'll give you a really quick virtual field trip so that you can see some present-day sites that demonstrate how the Scottish prisoners influenced New England culture. The first one we've already talked about, which is the where 62 Scottish prisoners were hired. Now this is you can actually visit this. As I said, it's a National Historic Site. And these are replicas of the buildings where they worked. And we think they're quite accurate because they've done dozens of archaeological digs there. So they know, and as I said, there are some records of the company. So that's kind of an interesting place to visit, which I've actually done. Let's see. If you know Cambridge, Massachusetts at all, you'll probably know this cemetery. It's a beautiful, large cemetery with rolling hills and plenty of mature trees. And I recommend you take a walk in this cemetery. And then you'll come across this fence. And I don't know if you can see it, but it says, Scots Charitable Society, Boston, instituted 1657. Remember we talked about how this society provided for the burials of indigent Scots? Well, inside this fence are said to be buried 220 individuals with no headstones or other markers. So this elegant fence serves as the memorial for them, really, and they're the memorial for their, support for one another. This is an operating inn in Durham, New Hampshire. Yes, the title is spelled correctly. The original structure on this site, actually you can stay here or have a meal here. I've stayed overnight in this place. The original structure was built as early as 1651, likely by Scottish prisoners from Dunbar, including Thomas Doughty, as a home for their master, Valentine Hill. The inn sits above the Oyster River, where Hill and his Scots built one of the earliest sawmills in New Hampshire. This is one of the oldest houses in Maine, probably built around 1707 and used during the French and Indian Wars. It was first owned, the first European person to actually own this property was Alexander Maxwell, a Dunbar prisoner of war. He sold it to John McIntyre, who was the son of another prisoner, and John McIntyre is believed to have built this garrison. And because of it, and because there were so many Scots in this area, this is the neighborhood that was known as Scotland. And Thomas Doughty, we've talked about a bit. Dunbar prisoner of war, built the original dam on the Great Works River in North Berwick, hence the name. North Berwick itself was once known as Doughty Falls. And throughout Casco Bay, Maine, the Doughty name is very common. Actually, Thomas Doughty is my 8th great-grandfather. And I suspect the vast majority of the people throughout Casco Bay that are named Doughty are direct descendants of his. It's interesting because another branch of the family, when they went down to Salem during the King William's War, another branch stayed there in Massachusetts, and they spelled the name D-O-U-T-Y. So that's it, right? If you want further information, there's a couple of books you can purchase. I particularly recommend the second one. No, the first one's very good. It actually catalogs them. It's more thorough than mine. Mine's more of a narrative, and that one actually is very thorough about the Dunbar prisoners, and it's quite an interesting read. So thanks so much for coming out. I appreciate it. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
If you would repeat their questions so we can hear.
Sure, yes.
So you're talking about Scotland, and we think of Scotland as one country, but there were in fact two cultures in Scotland.
Right,
You have the Gaelic Highland culture and you have the Lowland Scots culture.
right.
And in looking at the documents and the names, it appears to me that these were largely Lowland Scots. But do you have evidence of where they came from and whether they actually spoke Gaelic or Scots?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and it's very complicated.
Yes.
So she's asking about, did you all hear it? She's asking about the two cultures in Scotland, the Highland culture and the Lowland culture, and they're very, very distinct, and their languages are distinct. Okay, so in northern Scotland, of course, people spoke Scots Gael, right, Gaelic, and they spoke Scots in southern Scotland, which is more probably closer to English or Danish, very close to English, but it really also is close to Danish in a way. So it's yet another language. Well, I have the feeling that Doughty came from the lowlands. And at that period of time, some of the guys probably spoke some English. The Highlanders, it's very doubtful that they spoke any English whatsoever. And I know that there were a number of Highlanders also. It's hard to say exactly where they came from. There are some people that know a few soldiers and exactly where they came from. But basically what happened was the lairds, so the wealthy people, would go out and conscript people from their neighborhood and force them, basically force them into the war. So I think they're both, the Highlands and Lowlands are represented among these groups. And they did say that, I have read some things that said that when they arrived here, some of the Scots prisoners were having a terrible time communicating with others, because the main language was English, obviously. So.
One question. This is not usually a shy group.
No,
They're processed.
I've overwhelmed them. Yeah.
Did the industrialists that took these slaves, did they have to pay for them, or were they?
Yes, but they didn't pay. But they didn't pay their families, right? So they paid a little bit, but for the most part, they were gifted. Let's just put it that way. That they were. They had to pay the men who gathered them up and brought them over. So they basically had to pay for their transportation. But they ended up having 6, 7, or 8 years of free labor. The only things they had to supply were housing, food, and clothing for them. Yeah. Yes.
Your 8th granddaughter.
Oh, yes.
How did you first get interested in the story?
So I was looking back in my family tree, and I came across this guy, and it said that he had been one of the Scottish prisoners that was working in Piscataqua, and I was like, what? I didn't know anything about any Scottish prisoners in New England, and the more I dug, the more interesting it became, and I couldn't let the story go. That's kind of my personality. I have to shake it until it's dead, and I just found it really fascinating because I hadn't heard it. It just really changed my whole perspective, as you can see, on New England history. We weren't taught any of this stuff in school, and just made a really big difference. Yes, in the back.
When is that going to hit the history books that our kids are learning? Is this even a possibility to be taught? It really does change how we think of how this country was started.
It really does. It did for me, and it changed my whole perspective on immigration, and it's just very different. There was this great migration that supposedly came over around the years of 1630, and they were all Puritans, and they were all coming here. And it's true, they were all coming here because of religion, but they were also coming here because of business, and they were also coming here because of land and opportunity. I don't know whether, I don't really know whether schools have time to teach all of this. The 17th century, they have a tendency to gloss over, and they talk about the Pilgrims, and they don't talk about much else. But it was really an interesting period of time. As you can see, not just these prisoners, but there were, as I say, there were plenty of people of color here. The natives were trying to get along with these disparate communities. There were French people coming in, and of course the English and the French didn't get along, and it was very, but it was an interesting sort of melting pot. So it's hard to know, but I wish the schools would teach it a little more in depth. I didn't even understand this kind of thing. I didn't even hear anything about it when I was in college at university. So it just goes to show you that there's a lot of hidden history in New England. So, yes.
In New France, was there anything comparable to what happened here in the sense of export of prisoners to Quebec?
Well, I don't know that history as well, so I'm not sure. But I do know that people were shipped to France to work as laborers. I also know there's a story about a woman who was considered, someone has written a book about a woman in, I think it was 17th century France, who was actually shipped to New Orleans as a convict. So I'm sure there was a lot of that going on. I mean, England wasn't the only country doing that. That was something pretty common, that people were shipping other people away all the time. So I wish I knew more about the French history, actually. Yes?
Do you know if any of these prisoners were also sent to Nova Scotia? I actually know some villages there.
Really? He wanted to know whether any of the prisoners were sent to Nova Scotia. And I'm not aware of it. I just know of these groups that were sent to New England, Barbados, and I believe there were some sent to Virginia, the Virginia area. You know, Virginia at the time was more of a region than it was a state. I don't know about Nova Scotia.
There is a major Scots population.
There is.
Southwest Nova Scotia.
There is. And I also know a lot of those, there were a lot of people from New England who went there as loyalists
Yes.
during the Revolution.
They
So-
still celebrate Loyalist Day.
Yeah. And in fact, a lot of African Americans went there because the English said, you know, if you come and support us and don't work for your masters anymore, we'll set you free.
There's a whole bunch of people from New Jersey still waiting for us to lose the war.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Benjamin Franklin's son, for example, was one of those. Yeah. Yes.
I was just going to mention, talking about other places, but I've have lived on the Mohawk River Valley about 30 years, and now in Schenectady, which was settled in the 1650s by the Dutch. When that settlement changed over, similar periods of war, your last slide showed that, the most noted, he became a baronet. He was an immigrant from Ireland, but he imported about 600 Scots in the mid-1700s and founded this town, Johnstown, named after himself. But there were still these massive importations. And
Yes.
I was always curious, why not Irish? Why Scots? And
Right.
maybe, you know.
Well, I think that the case is that there were both. I think so. Scotland, compared to the question is that there were a lot of people who were also imported to New York, what is now New York, and they were Scots that were imported again, I suppose, as laborers and people to settle and people to sort of push the natives back. Scotland was a poor country. People were anxious, some people were anxious to leave, but it was also something that there were considered to be too many people. You could see from the laws that I mentioned that there were considered to be too many people for the land. So there was a land that people were working on, but there was nothing else for them to do. And so that's why a lot of them, I mean, it's hard to imagine what would have happened in England had they not been colonizers.
No.
Because they peopled half of the planet, and here's one place that they did. And as for the Irish, I have plenty of examples of people. The guy who ran the Great Works sawmill that I mentioned had a scheme whereby he sent some people to Ireland. They went down the streets and they gathered people up and they threw them in the holds of ships and they brought them over here. And there's a court case in Essex County, Massachusetts about this, that these two Scots were complaining bitterly that they had been in servitude for more than 7 years, that they were, as they said, taken out of their naked beds and simply put on a ship and brought here. And of course it's bitterly unfair, but the court ruled against them, if you can imagine, and they had to continue their indenture for some years. So it was going on a lot in Ireland, because Ireland too was impoverished. And it's not to say it wasn't going on in England. It was going on in England, because poor people that were English were also being shipped here, as well as elsewhere. So, yeah.
I'd just like to add to that, just speaking of the differences between the two cultures, both in Ireland and Scotland. You have Gaelic-speaking Catholics. And in Ireland, you had a lot of Gaelic-speaking Catholics, Irish-speaking Catholics. And my suspicion is that they prefer to send the people that might sort of understand English here. There's a book called To Hell or Connacht that describes Cromwell just massively sending Irish Catholic Gaelic speakers to Barbados.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
Yes.
I suspect that they were selected to go to different places. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
It does. It does to some degree. Yeah, I think that's true. And maybe, I don't know if you guys know this, but in the early part of the 17th century, there were tons of Scots shipped to Ireland. And that's why we have Northern Ireland today. Because those people were the Ulster Scots, right? They were people who were sent there because they were Protestant. And the idea was that they were going to, give the English a foothold in this very Catholic country.
Subdue the wild
Yeah,
Irish.
exactly. Yeah. So so when I talked about this social engineering, they were shipping people everywhere, for all different sorts of reasons. Yeah. Well, if that's it,
Questions for Carol?
yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Carol.
Thanks so much for coming out. Appreciate it.